often said that when a woman eats chocolate, it stimulates the production of the same brain chemicals as being in love. Perhaps we are all craving to be loved more, causing us to eat more sugar. The pancreas is the gland that secretes insulin, whose role is to help manage blood sugar. Dietary choices, stress, and estrogen balance can contribute to changes in insulin balance. In the audiovisual presentation, Insulin Balance, Sweet Surrender, Bev will explain the connection between stress and insulin imbalance and provides tangible natural solutions to maintaining healthy insulin balance.
Today we'll talk about insulin balance, and I call it Sweet Surrender because people often surrender to their cravings, and we want to look at ways that people can reduce their cravings and look at the whole picture as far as endocrine balance. I think what's useful to look at is to really look at the picture of how a person looks if they're in vibrant health or optimum health. And, things that come up as far as a picture, people always talk about complexion. They have great complexion. And I think it's really interesting from a herbal perspective because when we think about optimum health and skin, that's a reflection of how your internal organs are working. So is the liver working well? Is the kidney working well? And your bowels. If those primary eliminations aren't working well, then what will happen is the secondary ones, and the skin is one, will take over, and you'll end up having skin that's not as nice as, say, somebody who's in optimum health. Energy is always one that comes up. Having abundant energy. People always want to have more energy. So on the other side of that, feeling fatigued is something that we struggle with every day and is a sign that the body is working harder than it should to do its everyday tasks. Having an even mood is really important, and that's where you may have stress in your life, but you're dealing with it in a productive kind of way. You don't take it home at night. You're able to separate from work stress and home stress, and that you're able to dissipate that in some way. So even mood usually is a sign that there's some other things going on, and often food intolerance is something that I like to look at as far as that goes, but really it's a reflection of overall health as well. Regular bowel movements are important, and as a herbalist, I could talk about bowel movements for probably an hour or more. The best bowel movements is a bowel movement every time you take in food, a large meal. And usually with people, though, I'm quite happy if they have a bowel movement once a day. But really, I think the limitations for us having a bowel movement every time we eat is generally that we don't have enough fiber in our diet. And if we really ate whole foods in the quantities that we should, that because inherently there's so much fiber in those, that we end up having more bowel movements when we have more whole foods in our diet. Now, usually I like to say how many people fit that picture, and the reality is that most of us don't. We're all striving to be in that vibrant state of health. And so let's look at some ways that we can get there. Just as an overall picture of the endocrine system, if we start with the thyroid, there's many endocrine organs in the system. There's the thyroid, there's the ovaries, there's the adrenals, and the pancreas. But if we look at the thyroid first, thyroid produces thyroxine, which is T4, and it's inactive. Okay? What has to happen is that the liver has to convert it to T3. So having active thyroid hormone in your body is dependent on overall liver health. So if there isn't good liver function, then you won't have good translation of your T4 into T3. The next organ we'll look at is the ovaries. And I think in women's health and hormone replacement therapy, often if you go in with complaints, the ovaries are the only pieces of the picture that's typically looked at. So estrogen and progesterone being the important indicators for women's health. And that really is because estrogen does so much more than just cause our cycles in our body, but it is a really important part of our overall health. But as well, these other endocrine organs are important. So estrogen and progesterone are produced by the ovaries. And then we look at the adrenals. And the adrenals produce lots of different hormones. Adrenaline, which is your short-term fight or flight response. There's cortisol, which is the long-term version of adrenaline. So where you get your adrenaline rush from bungee jumping, or if you've been in a motor vehicle accident, or you've had some startle effect, that's where adrenaline comes in. But after a couple seconds or so, then cortisol is that long-term stress hormone. So if you have ongoing stress, the body will start to produce cortisol. And there's testosterone, which is really about libido for women, and aldosterone. And aldosterone is helping to balance fluid balance. So, it's the puffy hands, the rings around your ankles from your socks. Those kind of things give us little indications that aldosterone might not be being produced in the amount that it needs to be produced if there's some stress on the adrenal glands. And then there's the pancreas. And the pancreas produces insulin. And insulin is a very small molecule, unlike most of the other hormones, the steroid hormones being the ones coming from the adrenals and the ovaries. And the thyroid makes its own hormone thyroxine from iodine and a couple other molecules, but it's relatively small. And insulin also is a very small molecule, but it helps to stabilize glucose. Now, if we look at this overall picture, these hormones all work in concert with each other, and these endocrine organs all work in concert with each other. So if there's an imbalance in one place, the other organs will slow down or compensate in some kind of way. And what we find typically is that the adrenal glands are very, very key in this whole imbalance picture, because when we're under stress, it takes over everything. It kind of takes priority. And if we think about it from a whole evolution point of view, is that if we perceive there is danger, then the adrenals should have the lion's share, because survival is our main key goal. So there's a part of our brain that is sort of still Neanderthalic, where it triggers that sympathetic response, and then the body is brought into the sympathetic response, even though maybe intellectually you know that you're not really in danger. So the pancreas, the thyroid, the ovaries, and the adrenals, it was described back in the 30s that these all work in a feedback loop with each other. Now, what happens when you go through menopause, when the ovaries stop producing estrogen and progesterone, that the adrenals have to pick up the slack and make both estrogen and progesterone. So now it's got the majority of hormones have to be made in the adrenals. And with adrenal stress comes this inability to produce all these other hormones, which affects insulin really profoundly. So let's look at some factors that cause stress. If we look at emotional stressors, things like society, that's sort of a big one. We don't really value balance as a rule. We want people to push through their tiredness into their second wind. We glorify people that are CEOs that make lots of money and have lots of productivity. There's very little balance to talk about the other side of their lives. How are their marriages? How much time do they spend with their kids? Do they have any relaxation? What do they do in their lifestyle other than just being CEOs? And our whole society really drives us towards overworking. And really what that is stressing that we need to always trigger the sympathetic response. And even the way we live, as far as the shows that we watch, are very, traumatic. And like CSI is on, and there's blood and guts everywhere, and there's, accidents happening, and there's never any good news in the newspaper. So we're sort of surrounded by that fight or flight response. It's everywhere we look. As far as emotions go and causing stress, what it impacts first, and is usually harder to reverse, is sleep. That if you have emotional distress, you're usually having poor sleep. And the problem with that is that sleep is the place that we start to regenerate and heal our bodies. So if we're always in breakdown mode during the day and then we have bad sleep, we don't really have a place where our body can start to rebuild itself and repair the damage that's been done throughout the day. Then there's physical stressors. And that's things like diet. We are surrounded by stimulants, so refined foods, coffee, nutrient-deficient foods, and food intolerance, so foods that we take in continually and then our body gets intolerant to them. Those all can contribute to physical stressors. The problem with food intolerance is that if you're taking in these foods over and over again, it can lead to physical stress. So even though you may have not very much emotional stress, the physical stressors, that immune response triggers increased cortisol. And then what happens is that you're sort of seemingly not stressed, but your body is telling you that you're stressed. So food intolerance is a very key part to rule out, to understand adrenal stress if there aren't a lot of emotional stressors there. Dehydration is really key. When the tissues are dehydrated, they sense that they're under stress, and this can again cause cortisol to be triggered. And there are some instances where people are sleep deficient because of pain. So they may have very poor sleep because they have an inflammatory response, like a painful toe or a hip that they have to sleep on, or a shoulder that's continually sore, or a bunch of sort of musculoskeletal things that can lead to impaired stress. And again, that causes a lack of a place for us to rebuild our bodies. At night, the ribs will open up and the liver expands to about 3 times its size. And so what happens is that it has an increased capacity to really perfuse the tissues, get rid of the toxins. And in the morning, you have your morning pee and you have your bowel movement, and now you've gotten rid of all the toxins that the body has produced throughout the night. So that's where sleep is really important at keeping the balance. Let's look at insulin. What is insulin? Well, it's secreted by the pancreas, the islet cells of the pancreas. It is made solely in the pancreas itself. It's a very small molecule, and it's a very reactive molecule. What I mean by reactive is that minute by minute, it can change so that it keeps the glucose stable in the body as the needs arise. It's actually involved in maintaining what we call blood sugar, so the amount of glucose in our systems versus the amount of stored glucose, which is in the form of glycogen or fat. Glycogen is in the liver and the muscle tissues, and it can be stored as fat in the fat tissues. So what insulin actually does is it facilitates the entry of glucose into the cells. So when insulin is triggered, it will allow the glucose to come into the cells and be stored there. If there's low insulin, then that means you have lots of glucose in the blood. If there's high insulin, then you're going to have not very much glucose in the blood. So it makes sense that when you wake up in the morning, your insulin should be low because you haven't taken in any food yet. And after you eat, the insulin should be high because you've introduced glucose into your system by taking in carbohydrates and other food groups. So let's look at that cortisol-insulin connection. Cortisol is the stress hormone and tells you that you're in danger. So it would make sense that insulin should be suppressed in those situations, because if your body perceives danger, it wants all the energy that it can get. So it's going to release the glycogen from your muscles. It's going to release the glycogen from your liver. It's going to allow all the glucose to be in the bloodstream, because the number one food for your brain is sugar. And you kind of need your brain, if you're in danger, to be able to get out of a situation if you're in a dangerous situation, like being chased by an axe murderer, let's say. So this is a very important part of the stress response, is to have low insulin when cortisol's high. Let's look at the stages of insulin dysfunction. Typically what happens is that when you're in a stressful situation and cortisol is up, insulin will be suppressed. So then you're in a state of hypoinsulinemia. And what that means is that you have too much blood sugar in the bloodstream. So you have excess of glucose there. And we'll talk about what that really means in a little bit. Then what happens over time, as the adrenal glands start to fatigue, then cortisol will go down. We were talking about alarm and then resistance and then the failure stage. In resistance and failure, what happens then is cortisol goes back to normal or is suppressed, and then insulin sort of has free rein and starts to take over and can be increased, and you can get hyperinsulinemia. And then it's sort of the opposite problem, where you have all the glucose stored as glycogen and fat cells, but you don't have any insulin, you don't have any glucose in the bloodstream to feed the body. So although you have lots of stores, hyperinsulinemia doesn't allow those stores to come out. Okay? And what causes hyperinsulinemia or contributes to the cause of hyperinsulinemia is adrenal fatigue, but also the intake of excess refined carbohydrates. Because if you're constantly taking those in, really that's just sugar, then the body just keeps producing insulin until it just says, right, I better just keep the insulin levels high because I'm going to expect that there's lots of glucose that's going to be coming my way. So that's sort of how you can progress from having not enough insulin to too much insulin as it relates to adrenal stress and cortisol excess. So let's look at hypoinsulinemia. Typically you would have low fasting levels, so AM insulin levels are really low, and you'd also, after a meal, the insulin would be really low. Now what we have to be careful of is that when we're testing insulin, that we've actually introduced a carbohydrate into your meal before we take the test, so that we make sure that it gives your body a chance to produce insulin. Symptoms of hypoinsulinemia are really hyperglycemia, which means that there's too much glucose. So you get irritability, you may have headaches, you may feel really jittery between meals, because now what's happening is that the glucose is going up, your body's using it all, so you might sort of feel a little bit hyper or kind of edgy because of that sugar rush that you're getting. And then because there's not as many stores, what'll happen is it'll plummet, and that's when you get the headaches you can get, and you can feel really edgy in between or kind of shaky between meals, showing us that there's not a good there's not a good control of glucose in your system. Now let's look at treatment options for hypoinsulinemia. What we want to do is look back and say what's happening with the adrenals, because again, I find that the adrenals, because of that fight or flight response, that survival response, that adrenals are a place where it tends to all start. So if we try and treat adrenal dysfunction, as we talked about in the last discussion, also for hypoinsulinemia itself, what we want to do is to give things like glucose tolerance factors. It's a whole food supplement that will actually help to stabilize and stimulate insulin. Have frequent small meals, chromium, and if there's any immune connection, if the dysfunction's been around for a while, the immune system gets involved, and then we want to use things like protomorphogens. And also antioxidants are really important. One thing that happens with glucose, when there's too much glucose in the system, what tends to happen, it breaks down with oxygen and forms free radicals. And it forms a thing called homocysteine. And what homocysteine does is it's very destructive to DNA and to protective membranes of the nervous system, especially in the brain. So this has been a marker for things like multiple sclerosis, for Alzheimer's disease, and for early dementia, is having high homocysteine in the body and can be related to excess refined sugars in the body. So this is a really key part of reversing the process of too much glucose in the body, is to provide antioxidants into the system that will help to sop up those free radicals and get rid of the potential dangers to the nervous system tissue. Trace minerals are also very important in this case, as are essential fatty acids. Now let's look at the other problem where we've now gone from hypoinsulinemia to hyperinsulinemia. So as a continuum, the adrenals are starting to fatigue, and now you've got this excess insulin in the body. That's typically known as syndrome X or metabolic syndrome, and it's really common in menopause. And I think the reason why the studies show that it's so common in menopause, because adrenal fatigue is so common in menopause, and it can really globally affect your endocrine system in a multitude of ways. It's been estimated that about 25% of the North American population suffer from syndrome X or metabolic syndrome, and it is the precursor to late onset diabetes. Interesting that they used to call it late onset diabetes, although they're now having cases of teenagers getting late onset diabetes. And we can't really call it that anymore. It's diabetes 2. It's typically thought of as not being immune mediated, although I do believe in time there is an immune kind of mediated response. But at least at the beginning, it's a fact of having too many carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, and having that adrenal stress that's causing too much insulin in the system. As I mentioned, there's a very high incidence in perimenopause as well, and your menopause is made a lot worse by having hyperinsulinemia. And you're at an increased risk of diabetes 2, which is the late onset, of hypertension, of heart disease, of high cholesterol, of breast cancer, and polycystic ovarian syndrome. These are all related to insulin imbalance. And because of that connection with the glucose, it can also contribute to endometrial cancer and Alzheimer's disease. As I mentioned previously, taking in those refined foods can increase your risk as well. Now let's look at, there's some interesting stuff about hyperinsulinemia and menopause specifically. That glucose in the blood is brought into the tissues and turned into fat by the liver. Okay? Now the fat cells readily accept glucose in the receptors. So while you have hyperinsulinemia, what's happening is that you may introduce glucose into the system, but it's rapidly sopped up in the fat tissues. Okay? So as more fat tissues are produced, they're also sopping up all the glucose and rapidly putting it into the fat cells. So now you're gaining more fat. So what happens is that your body is really being starved of glucose when you have all of these stores of glucose in the way of fat cells. Therefore, you're getting hypoglycemia and you have tons of sweet cravings and carbohydrate cravings, and it sort of feeds on itself, but you really don't have any glucose in the system because it's all being stored. Now, the interesting connection to menopause is that fat cells manufacture estrogen. And because of that, as you have more fat cells, you get estrogen dominance. And estrogen dominant situations, examples are things like endometriosis and fibroids, heavy periods, flooding, those kind of things are all estrogen dominant situations. So this is where insulin can be related to estrogen and affect menopause quite greatly. So let's look at some symptoms of hypoglycemia. And the big one I find in menopause are night sweats. I like to separate out the differences between hot flushes. Do you get flushes during the day or do you get sweats at night? Sometimes people will say both, and that means we need to look at the reproductive system, the ovaries and how they're working, and we also need to check out insulin and how it's working as well, because night sweats are definitely a phenomena of not having enough glucose or hypoglycemia. Palpitations, anxiety, headaches, and just general weakness. And it makes sense that you have low energy because you don't have any glucose in your system. The body is not able to function without having the glucose in the system. As far as the brain goes, the cerebral glucose, then you may have confusion, irritability, and just a general feeling of spaciness. It's that Ally McBeal effect, the kind of not really being able to put it together, feeling like you can't really multitask, and there may be a lack of focus, and that's all because the brain is not getting its favorite food, and that is glucose. The other thing about metabolic syndrome is you tend to get the apple syndrome, where you get that mostly abdominal fat. So you're really holding on to your fat tissues around your abdomen and around your organs. And it's typically because, if you think about it from a proximity point of view, is that if your digestive tract is absorbing glucose and then the liver's converting it into fat quickly, the best place to get rid of it is just to plop it really close to where the digestive system, which is right here, right? It's like a fast, quick plop. Yep, that's what happens. And again, we are saying that you really have low energy because there is no available glucose. Another key is that you have cravings, constant and sometimes really uncontrollable cravings for refined foods and sugars, where it's once you start, it's really difficult to stop eating it, that there's that feedback loop that just tells you need more and more. And that's related to the insulin balance. So let's look at dietary things that you can do, because certainly diet has a really important part to play here, where it's about trying to eat as much whole grains and whole foods as you can. Lots of soluble fiber and whole grains. Soluble fiber is fruit. You just have to be careful that you're using fruits that aren't high in sugar. So the berries are the absolute best, along with whole grains. And decrease, or even omit, if you can, any refined, nutrient-deficient carbohydrates. When we get a lot of packaged things, there's lots of carbohydrates in them, and they really don't have any nutrients. Interesting, in my whole food nutrition talk at the end, I'll talk about how, deficiency is rampant, and there's studies to show that deficiency in vitamins and minerals in the average population who are sticking to the recommended food guide, and yet we don't have a skinny problem in North America. So we're taking in too many calories, but we're not getting enough nutrients. If we had foods that were rich in nutrients, then if we were overweight, we should also have too many vitamins and minerals in our body, and it's just not the case. So we want to make sure that we're keeping our diet fairly clean, we're drinking lots of water, and again, this glucose tolerance factor will help to modulate that insulin level so that it's more effective. And chromium is another key part of that as well. As far as supplements go, there's a couple. Inositol is one that I use very frequently because what it actually does is it helps to stabilize insulin levels and decrease homocysteine, specifically in the brain. So inositol is a really nice one. It also helps with dopamine and serotonin receptors, and can, when taken at night, in the case of insulin difficulties, can really help with sleep. And so that's one that I'll use a lot with people who are struggling with insulin stability. Alpha-lipoic acid is a fat-soluble antioxidant, and it helps to stabilize insulin as well, and it helps to sensitize the tissues to vitamin E and C. So a broad-spectrum antioxidant is always really important, but alpha-lipoic acid is very specific for hyperinsulinemia and metabolic syndrome. So let's look at herbs for pancreatic health. There's some basic ones that I like to use that you can use in teas or juices that really do help stabilize insulin levels in the body. And that's Devil's Club. I always like to talk about local ones, and Devil's Club is here on the North Shore, and Vancouver is everywhere and can be used to really help stabilize insulin levels. It's been used in First Nations medicine for centuries. They typically gave it to their warriors when they were going out to hunt because they knew that they wouldn't eat for days. And so if they kept chewing on the Devil's Club root, it would help stave off hunger and help to stabilize their insulin levels. Artichoke, and you can get this in the form of juices. Nettles you can also get as tea, but artichoke helps with the liver, help protect liver cells, helps to decrease cholesterol, very important thing in menopause, and it also really helps to stabilize insulin. So artichoke is a really nice juice, it's a nice thing to eat, and it's really helpful to those areas. And nettles you can have as a tea, and really, really high in trace minerals, very supportive for mucous membranes of the body, and it does really help to stabilize insulin as well. Then again, because the insulin balance is so heavily connected to adrenal balance, we always have to talk about using adrenal herbs to help the system. And again, with insulin imbalance, I'd always look at the adrenals first to try and stabilize what's going on there, because until you get the cortisol back to normal, you're always going to have these insulin challenges. So I think those two things go hand in hand, but if I were looking at sort of overall global endocrine or hormonal treatment, I would look at treating the adrenals first and then help support the insulin once things are stabilized. So again, adrenal herbs are things like borage. I always like to throw in some local herbs, and borage is a wonderful herb that can help modulate adrenal activity. Ashwagandha, which is an Ayurvedic herb or an East Indian herb, which is good for adrenal health, and licorice root. And I'm not talking about those little pipes that have the little red sparkly things on them. We're actually talking about real licorice root. Now, there are some licorice candies that have licorice root in them, but most of them are pretty much molasses. So you want to make sure you're getting some licorice root and using it as a tea and taking it in small quantities. I must say that with licorice, as a caution, that people who have issues with high blood pressure or fluid retention, it's not always the best herb, but it's a nice add-on in small quantities for stabilizing insulin levels and can be used as a tea quite nicely if you're having symptoms throughout the day. Now again, because the liver is so key and the kidneys and the digestive tract are so key to kind of overall hormonal health, we want to look at improving elimination where there may be problems. Just sort of tidying things up so that the body can work in a more efficient way. So things like dandelion root and leaf, you can get this as a juice in most health food stores, and the root is really excellent for supporting proper liver function, and the leaf is excellent for supporting and protecting the kidneys. So as a combination, it's really nice. It's a nice first step to take to help to stabilize good eliminative function. Also, dandelion root contains inulin, which helps to stabilize insulin. So that's another key, and specifically why that particular herb is really good as a general constitutional for people who have insulin issues. Mucous membrane supportive is calendula or marigold. And if there's any irritation to the mucous membranes, slippery elm is another really great herb for calming down the inflammatory process and bringing things back to normal. Because again, because our mucous membranes are sort of the first place where we come in contact with toxins, it's always nice to keep them supportive, making sure the nutrients are getting over them properly so that we're improving our overall constitutional health. Now, because there's such a profound connection between the nervous system, the endocrine system, and the immune system, it's very key to make sure you're supporting all of the other systems other than the hormonal system so you're getting an overall balance. So as far as immune system support, some good modulators that you can take long-term for healthy immune function are things like echinacea, astragalus, and the medicinal mushrooms. So there's a multitude of them. There's cordyceps, there's ganoderma, there's shiitake. I always like talking about shiitake in particular because those are ones that are readily available, and you can add them to soups and stews and food, and generally take in mushrooms as a part of your diet. And mushrooms, you may not know, but mushrooms are very high in protein as well, so can replace in a meal your protein source as well. Then for nervous system support, two key things for that myelin sheath or the protective coating around your nerves are B vitamins, and I like to use whole foods, so nutritional yeast is a really nice way. There's also bee pollen, those types of things that are really good natural source of B vitamins. And essential fatty acids, having good omega-3s for nervous system support is very, very important. Now, omega-3, 6s, and 9s, the 6s and 9s are usually in the plants, and then the 3s are usually found in the fish oils. And I myself like to use the fish oils when there is an immediate hormonal imbalance because it's an immediate precursor to pregnenolone, which turns into cholesterol, which turns into all the reproductive hormones and adrenal hormones that are needed for balance. So for nervous system support, I like to recommend 1,200 milligrams of DHA. And DHA is specifically in omega-3s and very, very high in cod liver oil. So if you can find a good quality cod liver oil, then make sure you're taking 1,200 milligrams to support the nervous system. It's very important. As far as herbs go, wild oats, passion flower, and skullcap are all great herbs. You can put them as a combination and make as a tea to really help support healthy nervous system function. And because we talk about holistic therapies and natural medicine, we're always talking about, rather than just shutting off the symptom, we want to get to the underlying cause and bring that balance back to be able to, so the body can actually heal itself. Nutritional support is really key. And what I've done is sort of taken some different aspects from different therapies I think fundamentally when we look at foods, and over the years in taking a food diaries from people, I noticed that typically people don't eat enough vegetables. And I often feel like people's mother by saying, you know, eat your vegetables, because it's so key to health. And that if we think about our needs in our body, trace minerals, vitamins, and fiber, that vegetables house all of those things in a very compact and efficient way. It even contains carbohydrates, so it's a very good source of food. And a lot of people, because of their schedules and whatnot, aren't able to take in the recommended 5 half cups a day of vegetables. That's the minimum. So what I recommend is to do juicing if you can, or buy very good quality vegetable juices and have 8 to 12 glasses a day when you're in an acute phase of a health concern. Maintenance may be a couple cups a day, but you want to really step that up if you're really trying to improve your health rapidly. Because what happens is that juices have all these nutrients in a very absorbable form, so the body can then just take it immediately, and you're flooded with nutrients, and then it can heal so much faster if it has those. Hydration is really key. What you want to do is take your weight in pounds, divide it by 2, and that's the number of ounces that you should drink a day. And keep in mind that if you're taking in caffeine, you need to add a cup for every cup of caffeine you drink. And if you're drinking beverages that have sugar, you also want to add another cup if you're taking in sugar, because those are both diuretics and will cause you to lose more fluid out of your body. So 8 ounces makes a cup, and you can do the math and figure out how much you should be taking every day. And keep in mind when you're introducing this water that you do it over a period of time, say 1 cup a week, especially if you're starting at 1 cup and a day and you have to get to 10, that you're just increasing slowly so that your body can equilibrate it to it and you don't just end up peeing it all out in a day. Other important things are things like manual therapies, doing lots of massage, cranial therapy, acupuncture, lymphatic drainage. There's lots of things out there that are great manual therapies that can actually speed up the rate at which your body heals, just because it's helping to get the toxins out of the body faster and move the systems in a way that can't be done if you're just taking in remedies and eating differently. And saunas are really great. All those kinds of things are really important as far as overall holistic treatment. In visualizing health, I often think about myself when I felt to be in my healthiest form, and then I try to take that vision of me and plop it into who I am now. So there's a lot of different visualization techniques and meditation techniques that help you do that. But since it has been proven that your perceptions can actually change your genetic code, and there's been studies to show that physiologically things change when you also are visualizing things, then I think that that's a really important part of improving your health. And again, as we spoke of before, high nutrient foods that are easy to digest is a very important part of nutritional support and overall holistic support for the body. So I hope I've sort of given you a bit of a sense of how insulin works in your body, what kind of things you can do to try to improve insulin balance, and then some tips on overall balance and how to support the body to bring it back into health again.